When you stop trying to be understood, everything begins to change. Not immediately, not softly, but deeply, quietly, irrevocably. Because the moment you stop begging the world to see you correctly, you step out of a prison most people never even realize they are living inside. And that prison is not built from walls, it is built from explanations, from justifications, from emotional labor, from the exhausting habit of trying to translate your soul into a language other people will not distort, mock, or reject. Most people waste years, sometimes entire lives, trying to be understood by people who never had the capacity to understand them in the first place. They keep speaking, keep clarifying, keep softening, keep defending, keep revealing more of themselves, as if enough honesty will finally break through the fog. But it never does. Because the problem was never only communication. The problem was perception. The problem was projection. The problem was that some people are not looking at you. They are looking through the filter of their own wounds. They are not meeting your truth. They are meeting the story their mind has already written about you. And once you see that, something inside you begins to fracture. In the best possible way, the illusion begins to die. The need to explain begins to weaken. The desperation to be correctly interpreted begins to feel childish, almost tragic. And for the first time, you begin to understand a truth that is both devastating and liberating. You were never fully in control of whether people understood you. You were only in control of whether you kept abandoning yourself in the attempt. Carl Jung understood this with brutal clarity. He knew that the human psyche is not neutral. It does not simply observe. It interprets, it distorts, it projects. It protects itself from what it cannot tolerate. That is why two people can witness the exact same moment and walk away with completely different realities. One calls it love, another calls it manipulation, one calls it strength, another calls it arrogance, one calls it confidence, another calls it threat, one calls it silence, another calls it rejection. Nothing is only what it is. It is also what the observer is carrying inside, and that changes everything. Because the moment you understand this, you stop making your peace dependent on being seen through pure eyes. You stop building your worth on the hope that everyone will finally get you. You stop offering your inner world to people who have already proven they can only receive fragments. And that is where the real power begins, not in being perfectly understood, in no longer needing to be. Most suffering begins when a person confuses being misunderstood with being wrong. They think, if I could just explain it better, then I would finally be safe. If I could just say it one more time, maybe they would stop twisting my meaning. If I could just become calmer, clearer, gentler, more logical, more useful, more agreeable, then maybe they would finally look at me with kindness. But look closely at that impulse. That is not communication. That is survival. That is the wounded self trying to secure belonging by making itself easier to consume. And it is exhausting, because every time you try to become understandable to people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you are not moving closer to truth. You are moving farther away from yourself, little by little, day by day, until one morning you wake up and realize you have become fluent in everybody else's expectations and nearly illiterate in your own inner language. That is the danger Jung would have recognized immediately, the danger of a life organized around external approval, the danger of a psyche that keeps adjusting itself to remain acceptable, the danger of a soul that begins to believe its survival depends on being palatable. And what a terrible word that is. Palatable, digestible, acceptable, safe, easy. The words sound harmless. But psychologically they are brutal, because what they really mean is this: do not be too real. Do not be too intense. Do not be too honest. Do not be too much. Do not become inconvenient. Do not become difficult to reduce. Do not become someone who cannot be neatly placed inside an old category. That is why growth creates tension. That is why authenticity unsettles the room. That is why a person who stops explaining themselves begins to make certain people deeply uncomfortable. Because explanation was their access point. Explanation was the bridge they used to reach your vulnerability. Explanation was how they kept you inside the role they had assigned to you. And once you stop feeding that system, the whole structure begins to shake. People do not always resent your strength. Sometimes they resent your refusal to keep performing weakness. They do not always hate your growth. Sometimes they hate the fact that your growth exposes how dependent they were on the old version of you. They liked the version of you that made them feel stable. They liked the version of you that apologized too quickly. They liked the version of you that absorbed the tension. They liked the version of you that explained every feeling, every boundary, every silence, every hesitation, every change of heart. Because as long as you were busy defending your reality, they never had to question their own. But the moment you stop trying to make yourself understandable to everyone, you remove one of the most powerful levers people use to control each other. The lever of guilt, the lever of doubt, the lever of emotional confusion, the lever of making you feel responsible for how others choose to interpret you. And when that lever disappears, so does a great deal of social power. Carl Jung would have called this movement a step toward individuation, a movement away from the collective script and back toward the self, a return to the center. But the return is not gentle, it is not comfortable, it is not designed to preserve your old identity intact. Because your old identity was built, at least in part, around being understood enough to stay safe, and safety can become a cage when it demands self-erasure. So the moment you begin to stop explaining yourself, a strange grief may appear. At first, it feels like loss. You may feel guilty, you may feel cold, you may feel selfish, you may feel like you are becoming distant, unreadable, or difficult. You may even miss the old habit of over-explaining, because over-explaining gave you a temporary illusion of control. At least if you kept talking, you felt like you were doing something. At least if you kept justifying, you felt like you were fighting for your place. At least if you kept opening yourself up, you felt like truth might still save you. But truth does not save those who keep abandoning themselves to earn access to people who never intended to understand. Truth liberates those who are finally willing to face the loneliness of being real. And yes, there is loneliness in this path, a profound loneliness. The loneliness of no longer being available for emotional distortion. The loneliness of not being easily summarized. The loneliness of realizing that many people loved a version of you that required less from them. The loneliness of seeing how much of your social world was built on roles, contracts, reactions, and unconscious bargains nobody ever said out loud. I will be who you expect me to be. If you let me stay, I will remain easy. If you do not challenge me, I will remain useful if you keep me close. I will remain understandable if I keep shrinking my truth. These are the invisible agreements that shape so many lives. And Jung saw the spiritual danger in that kind of arrangement, because a person who lives entirely for the comfort of others does not become noble. They become fragmented. They become split between what they feel and what they show, between what they know and what they allow, between who they are and who they are permitted to be. That split is painful. It does not always look dramatic from the outside. Often it looks successful, polite, friendly, responsible, stable, but inside something is slowly collapsing. The person becomes tired for no clear reason, irritable without knowing why, numb in places where they should feel alive, anxious in situations that should feel ordinary, disconnected from desire, disconnected from anger, disconnected from the raw pulse of their own existence. Because so much of their energy has gone into translation, so much of their energy has gone into being understood, so much of their energy has gone into helping other people feel comfortable with a version of them that is easier to accept. And the psyche eventually pays the bill. It always does. What you suppress does not disappear. What you deny does not die. What you exile becomes part of the shadow. And the shadow is not only the dark side of the personality. It is also the part of you that was never given permission to fully exist. The anger you were told was too much. The ambition you were told was selfish. The sensitivity you were told was weakness. The depth you were told was dramatic. The boundary you were told was cruel. The truth you were told was unnecessary. All of it goes underground. All of it waits. All of it accumulates pressure. And one day that pressure becomes unbearable. Maybe not in a visible explosion. Maybe in silence. Maybe in withdrawal. Maybe in the sudden realization that you are exhausted from being a version of yourself that no longer feels alive. That is when the deeper question arrives. Not how can I make them understand me, but why am I still giving so much power to people who keep choosing confusion over clarity? Why am I still exhausting myself for people who only require me to remain legible, not real? Why does being misunderstood still feel like failure instead of freedom? That question changes the direction of a life, because it shifts the center of gravity from the outer world back to the inner one, and the inner world is where Jung always pointed us. He knew that psychological maturity begins when a person stops outsourcing their reality, stops asking the crowd to certify their being, stops needing universal approval to feel legitimate, stops mistaking social ease for inner truth. That does not mean becoming cold. It does not mean becoming arrogant. It does not mean becoming indifferent. It means becoming rooted. And rooted people are harder to move, harder to manipulate, harder to reduce, harder to guilt into self-betrayal. They do not rush to explain every emotion. They do not panic when misunderstood. They do not fold themselves into whatever shape the room prefers. They do not beg the world for permission to remain whole. And because of that, they begin to change the atmosphere around them. People sense it immediately, not always consciously, but definitely. Something is different. The reactive person is gone. The over-explainer is fading. The emotional self-surrender is no longer automatic. And in its place, a quieter force is emerging. A force that does not shout. A force that does not plead. A force that does not need to be validated before it can exist. That force is self-possession. Not performance, not dominance, in the shallow sense. Not control over others, control over the part of you that used to collapse at the first sign of confusion. This is why silence becomes so powerful on the path Jung described. Not because silence makes you mysterious for the sake of appearing strong, that is still performance. True silence is something deeper. It is the refusal to let every misunderstanding drag you out of your center. It is the refusal to turn your soul into a courtroom where every feeling must be defended. It is the refusal to keep offering emotional essays to people who are only reading for contradiction. Silence, when it comes from inner authority, is not emptiness. It is density. It carries weight. It says, I know what I know. It says, I feel what I feel. It says, I do not need your agreement to remain real. And that is where your power returns. Because now you are no longer living for the reaction. You are no longer sculpting your identity around other people's comfort. You are no longer arranging your humanity to reduce the discomfort of those who cannot tolerate your depth. And yes, some people will drift away. Some will become distant. Some will call you changed. Some will accuse you of becoming colder when in truth you are simply becoming less available to self-abandonment. Some will say you are harder to talk to. Some will say you are different. Some will say they miss the old you, but they do not always miss you. Sometimes they miss the access. Sometimes they miss the predictability. Sometimes they miss the version of you that never challenged their unconscious needs. Sometimes they miss the emotional service you provided without asking enough in return. And this is one of the most painful awakenings a person can have. To realize that being loved for your availability is not the same as being loved for your truth. To realize that being valued for your usefulness is not the same as being seen. To realize that being emotionally consumed is not the same as being known. That realization can break something open inside you. It can also free you, because once you see the difference, you stop begging for crumbs and calling it intimacy. You stop calling emotional dependency love. You stop calling constant interpretation connection. You stop calling endurance loyalty when it is really just fear wearing a familiar face. And slowly, painfully, your standards begin to rise, not in a loud performative way, in a private way. The way a soul rises when it is tired of being cheapened. The way a spirit rises when it has spent too many years being convenient. The way a person rises when they finally understand that the right people do not need you to explain your entire inner universe before they treat you with dignity. The right people can feel your boundaries without punishing you. The right people can hear your silence without taking it personally. The right people can witness your growth without trying to drag you back into your old shape. The right people do not demand that you become easier to digest to deserve respect. And that changes everything, because now your life begins to reorganize itself around truth instead of performance. You speak less, but with more conviction. You explain less, but with more clarity. You react less, but with more awareness. You become more selective with your time, your words, your presence, your emotional energy. And every one of those choices is a quiet act of reclamation, a taking back, a returning, a refusal to remain available to forces that feed on confusion. This is what Jung would have seen as the beginning of real psychological freedom. Not the freedom to do whatever you want, the freedom to stop betraying yourself every time someone else feels uncomfortable, the freedom to disappoint the world a little in order to stop disappearing inside it, the freedom to let misunderstanding exist without making it your burden to repair every distortion, the freedom to remain steady even when others cannot categorize you anymore, the freedom to become too real for the roles they assigned you. And that freedom may cost you. It may cost you some relationships. It may cost you approval. It may cost you the false peace that came from keeping everyone else comfortable. But what it gives back is far greater. Clarity, presence, energy, integrity, a life no longer arranged around fear. A life no longer curated for the fragile egos of people who want the benefits of your presence without the responsibility of seeing your truth. And there is a kind of beauty in that, a severe beauty, a beautiful violence against the old self that kept dying quietly to keep the room calm. Because when you stop trying to be understood by everyone, you are not becoming harder to love. You are becoming harder to use. You are becoming harder to define from the outside. You are becoming harder to destabilize through misinterpretation. You are becoming less available for the emotional games that depend on your doubt. And in that space, something sacred opens. You begin to know yourself without an audience. You begin to feel your own thoughts without asking for permission. You begin to stand in your own presence without needing the world to echo it back. That is the beginning of wholeness. That is the beginning of individuation. That is the beginning of becoming someone who no longer needs to be universally understood in order to be profoundly real. So let the misunderstandings happen. Let the projections land where they may. Let the people who need a smaller version of you keep that version in their minds. You do not owe your authenticity to their comfort. You do not owe your soul to their categories. You do not owe endless explanation to those committed to distortion. You owe yourself something far greater. You owe yourself the courage to remain true even when truth makes you lonely. You owe yourself the discipline to stop begging the world for a kind of clarity it may never give. You owe yourself the peace that comes from no longer making your worth dependent on being correctly interpreted. And once you choose that, something profound shifts, not just in how people see you, in how you see yourself. You stop shrinking, you stop pleading, you stop over-explaining, you stop chasing approval like it is oxygen. You start living from the center instead of the wound. You start responding instead of reacting. You start choosing instead of appeasing. You start becoming someone the world can no longer easily script. And that is when everything changes. Not because everyone finally understands you, because you finally stopped needing them to. And that is when everything changes. Because once you stop needing people to understand you in order to feel real, you no longer hand them the power to define your identity. You stop living as a reaction. You stop living as a correction. You stop living as an apology for your own existence. And something within you, something long buried, something patient and silent and almost forgotten, begins to rise, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. It rises in the way your shoulders relax when you stop forcing yourself to be easy. It rises in the way your voice becomes calmer when you no longer need to win every interpretation. It rises in the way your mind stops racing to prepare explanations for people who were never listening with the intention to understand. That is the beginning of inner peace. Not comfort, not social success, not approval, peace. The kind of peace that comes when the war against your own truth finally ends. Most people never realize how much of their suffering is created by this invisible war. They are not only battling misunderstanding, they are battling the shame of being misunderstood. They are battling the terror of being seen incorrectly. They are battling the belief that if someone does not understand them, then something must be wrong with them. But Jung would have recognized the error in that logic immediately, because understanding is not always a moral event. It is not always a sign of virtue. It is not always a measure of your worth. Sometimes it is simply a measure of another person's psychological capacity. And that capacity is limited by their own consciousness, their own wounds, their own projections, their own emotional immaturity, their own need to keep the world simple enough to feel safe inside it. This is why the most painful misunderstandings are often not accidental. They are the result of people protecting their own inner order. If they see you too clearly, then they must confront themselves. If they admit your truth, then they must question their own assumptions. If they recognize your evolution, then they must face the possibility that they have remained stagnant. And most people would rather preserve a false picture of you than risk destabilizing the picture they have of themselves. That is a hard truth. But once you accept it, you become less vulnerable to the emotional traps that once consumed you. You stop chasing fairness from those who are invested in distortion. You stop expecting depth from those who only know how to reduce. You stop demanding insight from people who use certainty to hide from complexity. And in that moment, something astonishing happens. Your energy returns, slowly at first. Then all at once, the parts of you that were exhausted from constant explanation begin to breathe again. The parts of you that were shrinking under scrutiny begin to expand. The parts of you that were silenced for the sake of harmony begin to speak in a deeper voice, a voice that does not ask for permission. That voice is not loud. It does not need to be. It is steady. It is grounded. It is unmistakably yours. And once you begin hearing it clearly, you also begin to hear the truth about the life you were living before this awakening. You were not only trying to be understood, you were trying to be safe, you were trying to avoid rejection. You were trying to control how others would respond so that you would not have to feel the pain of being seen and still not accepted. That is why the need to be understood can become so addictive. Because it promises relief. It promises belonging. It promises the fantasy that if you can just get the explanation right, then you will finally be spared the pain of being misread. But life is rarely that merciful. And Jung knew that maturity begins when a person stops building their life around the hope of being rescued from discomfort. Instead, they learn to endure misunderstanding without collapsing into self-doubt. They learn to remain whole even when the room does not reflect them accurately. They learn that truth does not need applause to remain truth. This is where dignity is born, not in being admired, in remaining intact, not in being endlessly validated, in refusing to betray yourself just to avoid being disliked, not in forcing the world to see you clearly, in seeing yourself clearly enough that the world's confusion no longer destroys you, and that clarity changes your relationships in ways you cannot predict because people who are comfortable with your old self may begin to feel uneasy. The one who is easy to use becomes harder to access. The one who is easy to influence becomes more stable. The one who once explained everything now chooses silence. The one who once overgave now observes. The one who once bent themselves into every shape now stands in one shape only, their own. And for many people, that is deeply threatening, not because you became hostile, because you became unavailable to unconscious control. That is why the strongest shifts often happen without dramatic confrontation. You do not need to announce your transformation. You do not need to make speeches about your healing. You do not need to punish anyone. You simply stop participating in the old pattern. You stop offering your peace as payment for belonging. You stop collapsing into explanation every time someone misunderstands you. You stop auditioning for the role of the reasonable one in someone else's emotional theater. And the moment you do that, you become more difficult to manipulate. Because manipulation depends on emotional access. It depends on your fear of being misread. It depends on your belief that misunderstanding is intolerable. It depends on your willingness to overcompensate. When that fear weakens, the entire structure begins to collapse. And what remains is not emptiness. What remains is sovereignty, a quiet sovereignty. The kind that does not demand witnesses, the kind that does not need public recognition, the kind that is built in the hidden chambers of the self, where you stop asking the world to certify your being and begin certifying it from within. That is the real revolution, not the revolution of rebellion, the revolution of return. Return to your own mind, return to your own feeling, return to your own rhythm, return to your own integrity, return to the part of you that was never meant to be shaped by fear alone. And when that return happens, you begin to notice how artificial so much of your life has been. The forced smile, the careful tone, the empty agreement, the over-explanation, the apology that was never truly yours, the silence you used to hide your real opinion, the performance of calm that covered a storm inside, the careful self-editing, the constant internal monitoring, the exhausting work of staying acceptable. You begin to see that all of it had a cost, and the cost was not only energy, it was authenticity, it was presence, it was life. That is why this moment matters so much. Because once you stop trying to be understood at any price, you no longer live as a character written by social pressure. You begin to live as a real person, complex, contradictory, sometimes unreadable, sometimes quiet, sometimes intense, sometimes wounded, sometimes clear, sometimes still, but real. And reality is far more powerful than approval. Approval can be withdrawn. Reality remains. Approval can change with the mood of the room. Reality does not need the room. Approval is borrowed. Reality is owned. And what Jung understood, more than almost anyone, is that a person who owns their inner reality becomes much harder to shake. They may still be misunderstood. They may still be judged. They may still be left out of certain circles, certain relationships, certain emotional bargains. But they are no longer lost. They are no longer performing for survival. They are no longer cutting themselves into smaller and smaller pieces to make other people comfortable. They are becoming whole. And wholeness always changes the atmosphere around a person. People feel it. They may not understand it. They may resist it. They may even resent it. But they feel it. A whole person does not beg. A whole person does not chase validation like a starving animal. A whole person does not collapse when misinterpreted. A whole person does not spend every waking hour trying to convince the world of their goodness. A whole person simply is. And that presence is enough. So when people misunderstand you, let them. When they project, let them. When they reduce you, let them. When they call your silence cold, let them. When they complain that you have changed, let them. Because often what they are really saying is this: you are no longer available for the role I wrote for you. You are no longer helping me avoid my own inner work. You are no longer making my life easier by betraying yourself. You are no longer feeding the illusion that I get to define you. That is not a loss. That is liberation. And liberation rarely arrives looking like comfort. Often it looks like distance. Often it looks like solitude. Often it looks like grief. Often it looks like the end of a version of life you once thought you could not survive without. But if you stay with it, if you endure the silence long enough, if you refuse to run back into the old prison just because it was familiar, then something sacred begins to happen. You begin to trust yourself. Not perfectly, not all at once, but enough. Enough to stop begging. Enough to stop shrinking, enough to stop explaining every breath, enough to stop making your inner world a public negotiation. And once that trust takes root, your life becomes simpler and deeper at the same time. Simpler because the noise drops away. Deeper because what remains is real. You speak when it matters. You stay quiet when silence serves truth. You give your energy to what nourishes you. You stop treating every misunderstanding like an emergency. You stop living as if your existence depends on universal approval. You begin to understand that the right people do not need you to constantly defend your humanity. They can feel it. They can respect it. They can meet it. And the wrong people, the ones who depended on your confusion, your explanation, your softness, your overfunctioning, your fear of disapproval, they will naturally fall away. Not because you push them, because the old arrangement no longer works, because your growth has made the old dynamics impossible to sustain, because your truth has become too large to fit inside the cage you once called belonging. And if that feels painful, let it. Pain is often the price of returning to yourself, but it is a worthy price. Because on the other side of that pain is a life no longer split in half, a life no longer built on exhaustion, a life no longer shaped by the need to be interpreted correctly at every moment, a life that belongs to you, fully, finally, quietly. That is the end of the war. That is the beginning of peace. And that is why when you stop trying to be understood, everything changes. Not because the world suddenly becomes kinder, not because everyone becomes wiser, not because every relationship magically heals, but because you stop giving the world permission to decide whether your inner reality is valid. And once that permission is withdrawn, your life begins to reorganize around something far more powerful than being understood. It reorganizes around truth, and truth, once lived, changes everything.